The veteran thought his late wife had left him nothing but an abandoned hut in the mountains, until his German shepherd started digging beneath the floor. After the funeral, Daniel Walker believed the last chapter of his life had quietly closed. His wife Laura was gone, and all she left him was a strange key and a map to a vine-covered hut hidden deep in the Montana wilderness. It looked like nothing more than a forgotten shack swallowed by the forest. But the moment Daniel and his loyal German shepherd Atlas stepped inside, something felt wrong. Atlas began sniffing the floor, growling at the silence beneath the boards. What they uncovered that day would reveal a secret Laura had hidden for years, one that could change everything Daniel thought he knew about his wife. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The sky above the small Montana town was the color of cold steel when Daniel Walker stepped out of the church after his wife's funeral. The wind moved quietly through the tall pine trees behind the cemetery, carrying the faint smell of rain and distant snow from the mountains. People stood in small groups, speaking softly, their voices careful, respectful, as if any loud sound might break something fragile in the air. Daniel barely heard them. 35 years of marriage had ended that morning with a wooden coffin, a few handfuls of dirt, and a silence that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. Atlas walked beside him. The German shepherd stayed close to Daniel's leg, his broad shoulders brushing against the veteran's knee as if reminding him he wasn't alone. The dog's amber eyes moved constantly, alert and watchful, the way they had been during their days together overseas. Atlas had once been a military working dog. He had sniffed out explosives in dusty roads halfway around the world. Now he walked slowly beside a man who felt like a ghost in his own life. Daniel placed a rough hand on the dog's head. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Atlas pressed closer. The lawyer's office was only 2 blocks from the church, but the walk felt longer than any road Daniel had ever traveled. Inside the building, the air smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. The receptionist spoke softly and led Daniel down a quiet hallway. Atlas stayed beside him the entire time. They entered a small office where a thin man with gray hair stood up from behind a desk. "Mr. Walker," the lawyer said gently, "I'm Richard Collins. I'm very sorry for your loss." Daniel nodded once. He sat down heavily in the chair. Atlas lowered himself to the floor beside him, his ears still upright. There was another man already sitting in the room, Greg Harlan, Laura's cousin. Daniel had never trusted him. Greg leaned back in his chair like he owned the place, wearing an expensive jacket and a smug smile that didn't belong in a room meant for grief. "Well," Greg said casually, "let's get this over with." Daniel ignored him. The lawyer opened a folder. "Your wife left a will," he began. "It's very simple." Daniel expected something small. Laura had never cared about money, but they had worked hard all their lives. Surely there would be some savings, something that would help him keep the house running. Instead, the lawyer placed 2 things on the desk: a small iron key and a folded map. Daniel stared at them. "That's it?" he asked quietly. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Walker owned a piece of land in the mountains. It contains a small structure, a cabin or a hut." Daniel frowned. "What land?" Greg laughed. "Oh, you didn't know?" he said, shaking his head. "That's hilarious." Daniel's jaw tightened. Greg leaned forward, clearly enjoying the moment. "Your wife bought that dump years ago," he said. "Way out in the mountains. Old shack covered in weeds. I saw it once when I helped with some paperwork." The lawyer shot Greg a warning look, but Greg kept talking. "It's worthless," he continued. "A rotten hut in the middle of nowhere, no electricity, no road worth driving on." Daniel felt something twist in his chest. Laura had never told him about this. Not once in 35 years. "Why would she buy land without telling me?" Daniel asked slowly. The lawyer hesitated. "I am afraid I don't know." Greg snorted. "Probably one of her little projects," he said. Laura always had strange ideas. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. A low growl rolled through his chest. The sound was quiet, but deep enough to fill the room. Greg stiffened. "Hey!" he snapped. "Control your dog!" Daniel rested his hand on Atlas's neck. The dog's muscles were tense, his eyes locked on Greg. Atlas didn't trust him. And Daniel knew from experience that Atlas rarely misjudged people. The lawyer slid the key across the desk. "Mrs. Walker left instructions that you receive this," he said. "The property location is marked on the map." Daniel unfolded the paper slowly. The map showed a narrow road winding into the mountains north of town. A small X marked a clearing deep inside the forest. It was far enough that most people never went there. Daniel stared at the paper. Laura had been going there without telling him. For how long? Greg leaned forward again. "You planning to go see it?" he asked. Daniel didn't answer. Greg shrugged. "If I were you, I'd sell the land fast," he said, "before someone realizes how useless it is." The lawyer closed the folder. "That concludes the will." Daniel stood. He picked up the key. It was heavy and cold in his hand. Atlas rose immediately beside him. Greg stood too, slipping his hands into his pockets. "You know," he said casually, "Laura always had secrets." Daniel turned slowly. Greg's smile widened. "Maybe you'll find something interesting out there," he said. "Or maybe just a pile of rotten wood." Atlas stepped forward. The German shepherd's growl returned, deeper this time. Greg's smile faded. Daniel placed his hand firmly on the dog's collar. "Let's go," he said quietly. They left the office without another word. Outside, the wind had grown colder. The mountains stood dark on the horizon, their peaks wrapped in drifting clouds. Daniel unfolded the map again. Somewhere out there was a hut covered in vines. The last thing Laura Walker had left him. Atlas sat beside him on the sidewalk, watching the distant mountains. The dog's ears lifted slightly, almost as if he already knew that something important was waiting there. Something hidden. Something no one else had seen. Daniel slipped the key into his pocket, and for the first time since Laura's death, he felt something other than grief. A question. He looked toward the mountains again. "All right, Laura," he whispered softly. "Let's see what you left behind." Atlas wagged his tail once, and somewhere far away in the deep Montana wilderness, an old hut waited quietly beneath a mountain of vines. The town slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm after the funeral. Cars moved down the quiet main street. The diner across from the courthouse opened its doors for the afternoon crowd. A pickup truck rumbled past the hardware store. But for Daniel Walker, the world no longer felt like a place he belonged. That evening, he sat alone in the living room of the small ranch house he and Laura had shared for more than 3 decades. The sun had already dropped behind the western ridge, leaving the house in a soft blue shadow. Atlas lay on the floor near the couch, watching Daniel closely. The house felt wrong. Every sound echoed. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the ticking of the wall clock, the wind brushing against the windows. Daniel stared at the key resting on the coffee table. Laura had owned land in the mountains, and she had never told him. He picked up the key again, turning it slowly between his fingers. It was old iron, heavy and worn smooth in places, as if it had been used many times over the years. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered into the quiet room. Atlas lifted his head. The German shepherd stood and walked over, pressing his nose gently against Daniel's hand. Daniel rubbed the dog's ears absent-mindedly. "You always knew how to listen," he said quietly. Atlas had been with him longer than most people realized. Years ago, when Daniel came home from Iraq, he hadn't really come home at all. His body had returned, but the rest of him had stayed somewhere far away in the desert. The nightmares had started immediately. Explosions, dust, the sound of distant gunfire. Sometimes Daniel woke up shouting before he even realized where he was. Other times, he woke up reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Laura had never complained. Not once. She would sit beside him in the darkness, holding his hand until the shaking stopped. But the worst moments didn't come at night. They came during the day. A slammed door, a truck backfiring, fireworks on the 4th of July. Each sound could send Daniel's heart racing, as if he were back in a war zone. Doctors called it PTSD. To Daniel, it felt like a war that refused to end. Atlas had come into his life 2 years after the war. The dog had been scheduled for retirement from the military. During his service, Atlas had worked as an explosives detection dog, guiding soldiers safely through roads filled with hidden dangers. But during his last mission, Atlas had been injured by shrapnel while protecting his handler. The army had considered retiring him quietly. Daniel had stepped forward instead. "I'll take him," he had said. They understood each other immediately. 2 veterans, both carrying scars that no one else could see. Atlas had a calm strength about him. He watched everything, listened to everything. And somehow, when Daniel's thoughts started drifting back to darker places, Atlas always seemed to know. A nudge of the nose, a paw on his knee, a quiet presence beside him. Laura had once said that Atlas didn't just guard Daniel, he anchored him. And she had been right. Now Laura was gone. Daniel stood and walked into the kitchen. 2 coffee mugs still sat on the counter. He had washed neither of them. One belonged to Laura. He picked it up slowly. Her favorite mug had small painted sunflowers around the rim. She used to drink coffee on the porch every morning, watching the sun rise over the hills behind their property. Daniel placed the mug back down. The silence pressed in again. Atlas followed him through the kitchen and into the hallway. They stopped at the bedroom door. Daniel pushed it open. The room looked exactly the same as it had the morning Laura left for the hospital 3 weeks ago. Her sweater still hung on the back of the chair. Her reading glasses rested on the bedside table. The bed looked too big now. Daniel sat down heavily on the edge. Atlas jumped up beside him and curled against his leg. Daniel looked toward the window. Beyond the town, the dark outline of the Montana mountains stretched across the horizon. Somewhere out there was the place Laura had kept secret. Somewhere in those forests stood the hut covered in vines. The thought unsettled him. How many times had she gone there? How many weekends had she disappeared while telling him she was visiting friends? The idea that she had kept something from him for years left a strange, hollow feeling in his chest. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Atlas placed his head on Daniel's thigh. "You think we should go look at it?" Daniel asked softly. Atlas's ears lifted. The dog's tail thumped once against the bed. Daniel exhaled slowly. He hadn't planned on going, but the thought of that hidden place wouldn't leave him alone. If Laura had left him something there, he needed to understand why. Outside, the wind moved through the tall pines behind the house, carrying the distant scent of snow from the mountains. Daniel stood. He walked back into the living room and picked up the map. The road leading to the property wound deep into the wilderness north of town. Few people traveled those roads. Most of the land up there belonged to ranchers or the State Forest Service. But the X marked on the map sat alone in a narrow valley between two ridges. Remote, quiet, forgotten. Daniel folded the map carefully. "All right," he said. Atlas stood immediately. His tail began to wag slowly. "We'll go see it." Atlas barked once, sharp and excited. For the first time in days, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not hope, not yet, but movement. Something pulling him forward instead of holding him in place. He slipped the key back into his pocket. Tomorrow morning, he and Atlas would drive into the mountains, toward the place Laura had hidden from him for so many years, toward the hut covered in vines, and whatever secret waited beneath them. The next morning arrived quietly, wrapped in a thin gray mist that hung low over the Montana Valley. Daniel Walker woke before sunrise. Old habits from his military days had never really left him. Even after years back home, his body still knew how to rise before the world did. The house was cold. For a moment, he forgot why. Then the silence reminded him. Laura wasn't in the kitchen making coffee. She wasn't humming softly while watering the plants on the windowsill. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his eyes. Atlas was already awake. The German shepherd sat by the bedroom door, watching Daniel carefully, as if waiting for orders. "You're ready, huh?" Daniel said quietly. Atlas's tail swept once across the floor. Daniel stood and dressed slowly. He pulled on his old work boots and the thick canvas jacket he had worn for years on the ranch. Outside, the air smelled of pine and early frost. By the time the sun crept over the distant hills, Daniel had packed a small bag. Water, a flashlight, a few tools. He folded Laura's map and slipped it into his pocket. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat of Daniel's old pickup truck the moment the door opened. The engine rumbled to life. They drove north out of town just as the morning light began to stretch across the open land. The road wound through wide cattle pastures and rolling fields that slowly gave way to thicker forests. Pine trees grew taller the farther they drove. The mountains ahead rose like dark walls against the sky. Daniel drove mostly in silence. Atlas sat upright beside him, watching the road through the windshield. After 20 miles, the paved highway narrowed into a gravel road. The truck bounced lightly over the loose stones. Another 10 miles passed. Then the gravel road faded into something rougher, a narrow dirt path that cut between dense walls of pine and fir. Daniel slowed the truck. "This must be it," he murmured. Atlas leaned forward slightly, his ears alert. The forest here felt different, quieter. The sunlight barely touched the ground beneath the tall trees. Daniel checked the map again. The hand-drawn lines Laura had made were simple but clear. Follow the ridge, cross a small creek, turn left at the fallen pine. Daniel drove slowly. Soon the road dipped downward into a shallow valley where a narrow stream crossed the path. Water splashed beneath the tires. Atlas sniffed the air. They climbed the opposite side and continued deeper into the forest. The further they went, the less the road looked like something people used. Branches scraped softly against the truck doors. Tall grass brushed the undercarriage. Daniel felt a strange unease settle into his chest. He hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. If something happened out here, no one would know for hours. Atlas suddenly stood up in the seat. The dog's nose pressed against the glass. Daniel glanced over. "What is it, boy?" Atlas gave a low, quiet whine. The truck rounded a final bend, and the trees suddenly opened. Daniel slowed the truck to a stop. Before them lay a small clearing tucked between two forested hills. The grass grew wild and tall, and in the center of the clearing stood something that looked almost like part of the forest itself. Daniel stepped out of the truck slowly. Atlas jumped down beside him. For a moment, Daniel wasn't even sure he was looking at a building. The structure was completely swallowed by vines. Thick green tendrils crawled across every surface. Wild roses tangled through them. Morning glory flowers clung to the walls. It looked less like a house and more like a mound of living plants rising from the ground. Daniel walked closer. As he moved around the clearing, the shape became clearer. It was a hut, small, old, and almost completely buried beneath years of wild growth. "Laura," Daniel whispered. The door was invisible beneath the vines. The windows were hidden behind layers of leaves. Even the roof had disappeared under a thick blanket of green. Daniel felt a wave of frustration rise inside him. "This is it?" he muttered. All those secrets, all those unexplained trips Laura must have made. And this was what she left behind. A rotten shack in the middle of nowhere. Atlas walked slowly around the hut, sniffing the ground. Daniel shook his head. "Greg was right," he said bitterly. "Place is falling apart." The wind moved softly through the trees above. The vines rustled. Daniel turned away. "Well, that's that," he said. "We'll take a few pictures, call a realtor, and sell the land." Atlas suddenly barked. Daniel turned back. The German shepherd stood near the front wall of the hut, staring intensely at the thick curtain of vines. Atlas barked again. Then he began scratching at the ground. Daniel frowned. "Atlas," he said. The dog didn't stop. His paws dug into the dirt with urgency. "Atlas, heel!" Still, the dog ignored him. That had never happened before. Atlas was trained, disciplined, but now the German shepherd dug faster. The dirt began to scatter behind him. Daniel walked over. "Hey!" he said firmly. He grabbed Atlas by the collar. The dog resisted, muscles tense. Then Atlas lowered his nose to the ground and began digging again. Harder. Daniel stared. The behavior felt strangely familiar. Atlas had acted exactly like this in Iraq, whenever he detected something buried, something dangerous, or something important. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. "All right, hold on." He knelt beside the dog. The soil was loose here. Atlas had already dug a shallow hole. Daniel brushed the dirt aside with his hands. A dull metallic sound echoed softly. His fingers touched something solid beneath the soil. Daniel cleared more dirt away. A flat sheet of rusted metal slowly appeared beneath the surface. Daniel sat back on his heels. It wasn't just a piece of scrap. It was shaped too perfectly. Rectangular. Built into the ground. Daniel wiped the dirt from its edge. His breath slowed. It looked like a hatch. A hatch hidden beneath the earth beside the vine-covered hut. Atlas stepped back, watching Daniel carefully. The dog's ears remained upright. Daniel placed his hand against the metal surface. Cold. Solid. Very real. "What the hell were you hiding out here, Laura?" The forest around them remained silent, but suddenly the ruined hut didn't feel quite so empty anymore, because beneath the vines, and beneath the soil, something was waiting to be discovered. Daniel kept staring at the metal plate half buried in the dirt. The forest around the clearing felt suddenly quieter than before. Even the wind had softened, as if the tall pines themselves were listening. Atlas stood beside the hole he had dug, breathing hard, his paws dusty and streaked with dirt. Daniel brushed more soil away with his hands. The metal surface grew larger. Not a random sheet, not debris. A lid. It was built into the ground beside the hut, carefully fitted into a frame of weathered wood. Daniel ran his hand across it. Cold steel. Rust along the edges. But the center was solid and thick, the kind of metal meant to stay closed for a long time. "What were you doing out here, Laura?" he murmured. Atlas lowered his nose again and sniffed the hatch carefully. The dog whined softly. Daniel studied the surface. There was no handle visible, no obvious hinge, just a square panel set into the earth. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stood up slowly. For a moment, he simply looked around the clearing again. The hut sat in the center, like a forgotten thing nature had tried to swallow. Vines hung in heavy curtains from the roofline. Wild roses tangled through them. Clusters of pale purple morning glory flowers opened toward the sunlight. Up close, the plants looked thick and healthy, as if they had been growing here for years without interruption. Daniel walked toward the front of the hut. Atlas followed close behind. He pushed gently against the curtain of vines. Leaves rustled. The vines parted slightly under his weight. Behind them, the shape of a wooden door slowly revealed itself. The door was old but sturdy, its surface worn smooth by weather. A heavy iron lock sat in the center. Daniel reached into his pocket. The key Laura had left him rested in his palm. For a long moment, he simply held it there. Atlas sat down beside him, watching. "You knew about this place," Daniel said quietly. "You came here." He studied the door again. The vines hadn't grown randomly. They curled around the edges of the frame, almost like they had been guided there. The thought made Daniel uneasy. He pushed more vines aside. Some of the stems were thick, almost as thick as his wrist. Thorns scratched lightly against his jacket. Atlas suddenly stepped forward. The German shepherd began pulling at the vines with his teeth, helping clear the doorway. "Easy," Daniel said. But the dog kept working. Within a few minutes, enough of the vines had been pulled aside to reveal the door completely. Daniel lifted the key. It slid into the lock, perfectly. For a second, his hand froze. The metal was cold against his fingers. He hadn't felt this nervous since the war. Atlas leaned against his leg. Daniel exhaled slowly and turned the key. The lock resisted at first. Then, a deep metallic click echoed through the quiet clearing. The sound seemed loud in the still forest. Daniel pushed the door. At first it didn't move. The wood had swollen slightly from years of weather. Daniel leaned his shoulder against it. The hinges groaned. With a heavy creak, the door slowly swung inward. And something strange happened. A soft rain of petals drifted down from above the doorway. White petals, dozens of them. They floated slowly through the air like snowflakes before settling on the ground around Daniel's boots. Atlas barked once in surprise. Daniel stepped back. A sweet fragrance filled the air. It was strong. Strong enough that Daniel could smell it even above the sharp scent of pine trees. He looked up. The vines above the door were covered in clusters of small white flowers. Jasmine, or something very similar. But the blossoms were larger than ordinary jasmine, and there were hundreds of them. The moment the door opened, the movement had shaken loose a shower of petals. They continued drifting down around him. Daniel felt a strange tightness in his chest. Laura had loved flowers. Every spring she filled their porch with pots of herbs and blossoms. She used to say plants made a house feel alive. Atlas stepped cautiously toward the open doorway. The interior beyond it was dark. Daniel pulled the flashlight from his bag. The beam cut through the shadows. He expected to see rot, broken furniture, dust. Instead, The light revealed something completely different. The inside of the hut was clean, not spotless, but maintained. Shelves lined the walls. Glass jars sat neatly arranged across wooden tables. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters. Atlas stepped inside first. The dog sniffed the air carefully. Daniel followed slowly. The scent inside the hut was unlike anything he had experienced. Earth, flowers, herbs, something sharp and medicinal beneath it all. The beam of the flashlight moved across the walls, and then Daniel noticed the notebooks, dozens of them, stacked in careful rows. Handwritten labels marked the spines. Dates, years. The oldest one read. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He reached for one. Inside, the pages were filled with careful handwriting. Laura's handwriting. Diagrams of plants, notes about soil conditions, crossbreeding experiments, chemical properties. Daniel turned another page, and another. The entries continued, year after year, weekend after weekend. His breath caught in his throat. "Laura," he whispered. Atlas suddenly barked again. The dog stood beside a small wooden cabinet against the far wall. His tail wagged once. Then he pawed at the cabinet door. Daniel walked over slowly. "What is it, boy?" Atlas scratched again. Daniel opened the cabinet. Inside sat a metal box. Small. Locked. Daniel stared at it. There was a slot on the front. A keyhole. He slowly pulled Laura's key from the lock of the hut door. Then he looked back at the box. Atlas sat quietly beside him, watching. Daniel slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. He paused for a moment. His heart was beating faster now. The hut, the notebooks, the hidden hatch outside. And now this. Whatever Laura had been doing out here, it was far more than a forgotten cabin in the woods. Daniel turned the key. The lock clicked open, and something inside the box shifted softly. Atlas's ears lifted. Daniel slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay a sealed envelope, and on the front of it, written in Laura's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For Daniel." The forest outside remained silent, but inside the vine-covered hut, the truth Laura had hidden for years was finally waiting to be read. Daniel held the envelope carefully. The paper was thick and slightly yellowed, as if it had been waiting a long time to be opened. Laura's handwriting was unmistakable, small, neat, and steady, the same way she used to label jars in the kitchen or write reminders on the calendar by the refrigerator. For Daniel. Just those two words. Atlas sat beside the wooden table, watching Daniel with quiet patience. The German shepherd's ears remained upright, as if he sensed the moment mattered. Daniel slowly broke the seal. The flap opened with a faint crackle. Inside was a folded letter. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the pages. The smell of dried flowers and old paper rose gently from the letter. Daniel began to read. My dear Daniel, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I'm sorry you had to find this place alone. I wish I could have told you about it while I was alive. I thought about it many times, but every time I imagined explaining it, I knew you would tell me to stop, that we didn't have the money or the time. And you would have been right. But sometimes the heart decides things before logic can catch up. Daniel swallowed hard and continued reading. You remember the day the doctors told us about your injuries after the war. They said the damage to your nerves might get worse over time. They said the pain might grow stronger as the years passed. You tried to act brave about it, but I saw the fear in your eyes when they talked about future surgeries and treatments. We both knew we didn't have the kind of money those things would cost. That night, after you fell asleep, I made a promise to myself. If the day ever came when you needed help, real help, I would find a way to provide it. Daniel's throat tightened. Atlas shifted slightly, resting his chin on Daniel's knee. The letter continued. You always believed I was visiting friends on weekends. The truth is, I was coming here. This land belonged to an old rancher who passed away many years ago. The property was cheap because it was remote and difficult to reach. No one wanted it. But I saw something special about this valley. The soil here is rich. The plants that grow in these mountains are unique. Some of them have medicinal properties that scientists are still trying to understand. I began studying them. At first, it was just curiosity. But over time, it became something more. I started experimenting with crossbreeding certain plants that grow naturally in this region. Herbs used by early settlers. Flowers used in traditional medicine. Some of the combinations produced remarkable results. Daniel lowered the letter slightly. His eyes moved slowly across the shelves lining the walls. All those jars. All those dried plants. The notebooks filled with careful notes. Laura had been working here for years. He returned to the letter. The work was slow. Many experiments failed, but some succeeded. The plants growing on the outside of this hut are not wild vines. They are hybrids I developed. Their oils contain compounds that may help reduce nerve pain and inflammation. The same kind of pain you sometimes feel in your back and legs. I began corresponding with a few researchers at universities. They were interested in my findings. Very interested. Daniel's pulse quickened. He read faster now. I kept the work quiet because I didn't want to give you false hope. Research can take years, sometimes decades. But if the studies continue the way they have so far, these plants may become very valuable. More importantly, they may help people. People like you. Daniel lowered the letter again. His chest felt tight. He glanced at Atlas. You hear that, boy? He murmured softly. Atlas wagged his tail once. Daniel continued reading. The metal hatch you found outside stores my earliest samples. I sealed them away years ago for preservation. Inside the hut are the later generations of plants. The notebooks contain every step of the research. If anything happens to me, please contact the scientists whose names you'll find in the red notebook on the second shelf. They will know what to do. And Daniel, if you are angry that I kept this secret, I understand. But I needed to know that if the day came when you were alone, you would still have something. A purpose. A future. Daniel stopped reading. His vision blurred slightly. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The last lines of the letter waited below. You once told me that soldiers plant trees they may never sit under. I suppose that's what I've been doing here. Planting something for you. Something that might grow long after I'm gone. Take care of Atlas. And take care of yourself. All my love, Laura. Daniel lowered the letter slowly. The hut felt very quiet. Dust floated softly through the beam of the flashlight. Atlas rested his head against Daniel's leg again. For several minutes, Daniel didn't speak. He simply looked around the room. The shelves, the jars, the plants hanging from the rafters. Every inch of the hut carried Laura's careful touch. She had built this place slowly, patiently, for years, all while pretending she was simply visiting friends on weekends. Daniel leaned back in the wooden chair. A strange mixture of emotions washed over him. Grief, pride, confusion, and something else. Hope. Atlas suddenly stood up. The dog walked across the wooden floor, sniffing along the boards carefully. Daniel watched him. "Find something, boy?" Atlas's nose pressed against a spot near the center of the room. Then he began scratching at the floor. Daniel stood up slowly. The scratching sound echoed sharply through the hut. Atlas dug harder. His claws scraped against the wood. Then came a dull, hollow sound beneath the boards. Daniel froze. "That doesn't sound like regular flooring," he murmured. Atlas barked once. Daniel grabbed a small crowbar from his bag and knelt beside the spot Atlas had uncovered. He wedged the metal tip between the boards and pushed. The wood lifted slightly. Another push. The plank loosened and shifted aside. Beneath it, darkness opened. Daniel leaned closer and shined his flashlight down. His breath caught. A metal vault sat beneath the floor. Heavy, reinforced, much larger than the small hatch outside. Daniel looked at Atlas. The dog's tail wagged slowly. "Well, partner," Daniel said quietly. "Looks like Laura wasn't done surprising us yet." And somewhere, deep beneath the floor of the vine-covered hut, another secret waited to be revealed. Daniel crouched beside the loose plank, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam of light slid across the metal surface below. The vault looked old but strong. Thick steel walls, reinforced corners, the kind of storage meant to protect something important for a very long time. Atlas stood close beside him, breathing slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. Daniel lowered himself carefully to his knees and brushed away dust and splinters around the edge of the hidden compartment. The vault had a handle and another lock. Daniel felt a strange sense of disbelief. Laura had hidden this beneath the floor, beneath a hut buried in vines, in a valley that almost no one visited. "What were you building out here?" he whispered. Atlas sniffed the air again and gave a low, curious whine. Daniel ran his hand along the edge of the vault. Cold steel. The lock looked newer than the rest of the box, carefully maintained. He tried the key Laura had left him. It didn't fit. Daniel sat back slightly. "Of course it's not that simple," he muttered. Atlas pawed at the edge of the opening again. Then the dog's nose moved toward a nearby wooden beam under the table. He sniffed carefully, then barked once. Daniel followed the dog's gaze. The beam looked ordinary at first, but Atlas nudged it with his nose. Something shifted. Daniel leaned closer. The beam wasn't fixed in place. It was a cover. Daniel pulled gently. The wood slid free, revealing a narrow compartment carved into the support structure of the hut. Inside lay a small leather pouch. Daniel picked it up. The leather was worn and soft with age. When he opened it, something metallic clinked softly inside. Another key. Atlas wagged his tail. "Good work, partner," Daniel said. He held the new key up to the flashlight beam. It looked heavier than the first one. Industrial. The kind used for strong locks. Daniel lowered himself again beside the vault and inserted the key. For a moment nothing happened. Then the lock turned. A deep metallic click echoed through the hut. Daniel gripped the handle and pulled. The vault door opened slowly. Dust drifted upward as the lid lifted. Inside the compartment were dozens of sealed containers. Glass vials, metal sample boxes, carefully labeled envelopes. Daniel picked up one of the metal containers. The label read, "Hybrid Sample, Series 14. Another container, "Pain Response Study, Generation 3. Daniel stared at the contents in stunned silence. The vault was filled with preserved plant samples. Hundreds of them. Atlas sniffed one of the boxes carefully, but didn't touch it. Daniel reached deeper into the vault. Near the bottom lay a thick folder sealed inside a plastic sleeve. He opened it carefully. Inside were printed documents, official letters, research proposals, scientific reports. Daniel's eyes moved across the first page. University of Montana Medical Research Department. The second page bore another name, Rocky Mountain Biomedical Institute. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Laura hadn't just been experimenting alone. She had been communicating with scientists, collaborating. He turned another page. A printed email caught his attention. Subject: Preliminary results, compound extraction. The message was dated 2 years earlier. Dear Mrs. Walker, our early analysis of the samples you sent shows significant potential. The compound derived from your hybrid plant demonstrates unusually strong anti-inflammatory properties. Further testing will be necessary, but we believe your work could lead to an important development in nerve pain treatment. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. His heart pounded. Laura had been working with medical researchers. He read another document. Projected funding agreement, pending clinical trials. Estimated value of initial research rights, $1.2 million. Daniel blinked. He read the number again. Over $1 million. Atlas barked softly. Daniel looked down at the dog. You hear that? He murmured. Atlas tilted his head. Daniel leaned back against the wooden wall of the hut. For years, he had believed Laura lived a simple life beside him, working in her garden, helping neighbors, spending weekends visiting friends. But while he fought his own battles with memories of war, Laura had been quietly building something extraordinary, a future, not just for him, for others who suffered like he did. Daniel looked again at the vault filled with samples. Each container represented years of work, years of patience, years of secret effort. His chest tightened. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered. Atlas rested his head against Daniel's arm. The hut creaked softly as the wind moved through the vines outside. Daniel carefully placed the documents back into the folder. Then he noticed something else resting at the bottom of the vault. A smaller box, black, unlabeled. He lifted it out slowly. It was heavier than it looked. The lid opened with a quiet snap. Inside lay a single glass vial filled with dark green liquid. A small tag was tied to the neck of the vial. Daniel read the handwritten words. Final formula. His breath caught. This was the last step. The finished compound Laura had been developing. Atlas suddenly lifted his head sharply. The dog's ears stiffened. Daniel froze. Atlas turned toward the door. A low growl vibrated deep in the dog's throat. Daniel's pulse spiked instantly. Years of training snapped back into place. He shut the vault lid quietly and stood. Someone's out there, he whispered. Atlas moved toward the door silently. The vines rustled faintly outside. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Daniel reached for the flashlight and clicked it off. The hut fell into darkness. Atlas stood beside him, muscles tense, ready. And outside the vine-covered hut, someone else had just arrived. The sound came again, a slow crunch of gravel. Daniel stood motionless in the darkness of the hut, every muscle suddenly alert. Years of training had snapped awake inside him before his mind could even process what was happening. Atlas did not bark. That alone told Daniel everything he needed to know. The German shepherd stood like a statue beside the door, his body low, ears forward, his deep growl barely audible. Atlas had been trained not to give away their position. Daniel placed a steady hand on the dog's back. Outside, the footsteps moved closer through the tall grass. Daniel could see faint shapes through the curtain of vines where the sunlight pushed weakly into the hut. A shadow crossed the doorway. Someone was circling the clearing. Daniel's heart beat slowly but hard in his chest. He reached quietly into his bag and pulled out the small flashlight again, keeping it switched off. Atlas shifted his weight slightly. The footsteps stopped. For several seconds, the clearing went completely silent. Then came a voice. "Well now." The voice carried a familiar tone, arrogant, mocking. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Greg Harlan stepped into view outside the vines, Laura's cousin. Greg brushed a few branches aside and looked around the clearing with clear curiosity. "I knew it," he muttered. Daniel exhaled slowly. So Greg had followed him, or maybe he had guessed Daniel would eventually come out here. Atlas's growl deepened. Greg stepped closer to the hut and peered at the door Daniel had opened. "Well, look at that," he said with a smirk. "Door's open." He walked forward cautiously. Daniel stepped into the doorway before Greg could enter. The sudden movement made Greg jump slightly. "Well, well," Greg said, recovering quickly. "Didn't realize you were already here." Daniel folded his arms across his chest. "What are you doing here?" Greg shrugged casually. "Same thing you are," he said. "Checking out the property." Daniel stared at him. "You followed me." Greg smiled. "Let's just say I was curious," he replied. Atlas stepped forward beside Daniel, his massive shoulders filling the doorway. The dog's teeth showed slightly. Greg raised his hands. "Easy there," he said nervously. "That dog always did have an attitude." Atlas didn't move. Daniel said nothing. Greg glanced around the clearing again. "Place looks worse than I remembered," he said. Then his eyes drifted past Daniel's shoulder into the hut. For a brief second, Greg's expression changed. He had seen the shelves, the jars, the notebooks. "What's in there?" he asked. "Nothing that concerns you," Daniel replied calmly. Greg stepped closer. "I'm family too," he said. "Laura was my cousin." Daniel's eyes hardened. "You showed up at her funeral just to laugh about her will." Greg shrugged again. "That doesn't mean I don't have an interest in the property." Daniel remained silent. Greg leaned slightly to the side, trying to see past him. Atlas moved instantly, blocking the doorway completely. The German shepherd's growl rose louder now. Greg took a small step back. "All right," he said quickly. "No need for the guard dog." Daniel studied him carefully. "Why are you really here, Greg?" Greg hesitated. Then he sighed. "Fine," he said. "You want the truth?" Daniel waited. Greg pointed toward the hut. "I knew Laura was doing something out here," he said. "She bought the land years ago, remember? I handled some of the paperwork." Daniel's brow furrowed. "You never mentioned that before." Greg shrugged again. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. Greg stepped forward again, slowly. "But lately I've been hearing some interesting things." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What things?" Greg smiled again. "Word travels in small towns," he said. "Someone from the university asked about Laura last year." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Greg continued. "They were asking about research, plants, medical stuff." Greg gestured toward the hut. "So I figured, maybe that old shack isn't as worthless as it looks." Atlas barked sharply. Greg flinched. Daniel stepped forward. "You should leave." Greg looked annoyed now. "You don't get to decide that," he snapped. "I think I do," Daniel said quietly. The two men stared at each other. The wind moved softly through the vines above them. Greg finally looked away. He kicked at the dirt near the metal hatch Atlas had uncovered earlier. "What's that?" he asked. Daniel didn't answer. Greg bent slightly to look closer. Atlas lunged forward with a thunderous bark. Greg jumped back quickly. "All right," he shouted. "Relax." The dog's growl echoed across the clearing. Greg dusted off his jacket and took a step toward the truck parked at the edge of the clearing. "This isn't over," he said. Daniel said nothing. Greg paused beside the truck door. "If Laura left something valuable out here," he said slowly, "you're going to need help dealing with it." Daniel shook his head. "I don't need your help." Greg's eyes flashed. "We'll see about that," he muttered. Then he climbed into his vehicle and slammed the door. The engine roared to life. A moment later, the truck disappeared down the narrow dirt road. Silence returned to the valley. Atlas stood watching the road long after the vehicle was gone. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's neck. "Good boy," he murmured. Atlas's tail wagged slowly. Daniel turned back toward the hut, the open vault, the documents, the final formula Laura had left behind. Greg knew something was here. Maybe not everything, but enough to make him curious. Daniel looked out across the quiet Montana valley. The mountains stood tall around the clearing, like silent witnesses. Whatever Laura had built here, it was bigger than he had imagined. And now, someone else wanted a piece of it. Daniel walked back into the hut. Atlas followed closely behind. The mystery Laura left behind was no longer just a secret. Now it was something worth protecting. The clearing slowly returned to its natural quiet after Greg's truck disappeared down the narrow mountain road. Wind moved gently through the vines covering the hut, and the sweet scent of the white flowers drifted through the open doorway. Daniel stood in the center of the room, looking at the vault beneath the floorboards. Atlas sat beside him, still alert, occasionally glancing toward the forest outside, as if making sure Greg was truly gone. Daniel crouched down again and reopened the vault. The metal lid creaked softly. Inside, the containers and research folders remained exactly as he had left them, carefully organized, precise. Laura had always been methodical like that. Even in the kitchen, she labeled everything. Her spice jars were alphabetized. Her garden tools always hung in the same order on the shed wall. And now Daniel understood that the same discipline had been guiding her work here for years. He lifted one of the glass vials again and held it toward the light. The dark green liquid inside shimmered faintly. Atlas leaned forward and sniffed the air near the vial. Daniel smiled faintly. "No taste test, partner," he said. He placed the vial back in its slot. Then he opened the thick red notebook Laura had mentioned in the letter. The first page was filled with her handwriting. Plant Hybrid Series, Experimental Notes. Daniel flipped to the next page. Detailed diagrams of plant structures filled the margins. Chemical compositions, crossbreeding schedules, growth conditions. The more pages he turned, the more he realized how much time Laura had spent on this work. Entire weekends, entire seasons, years of patience. Some pages described failures, plants that refused to grow, samples that lost potency after drying. But other entries showed breakthroughs, underlined notes, exclamation points in the margins, promising compounds extracted from certain hybrid flowers. Daniel turned another page and paused. A photograph had been taped beside the notes. The picture showed Laura standing in this very hut. She wore a wide-brimmed gardening hat and dirt-covered gloves. She was smiling. The same warm smile Daniel remembered from their porch on summer evenings. Behind her in the photo, the shelves of plants were still half empty. The date in the corner read 2008. Daniel stared at the image for a long moment. "You were building this the whole time," he murmured. Atlas rested his head gently against Daniel's arm. Daniel flipped further through the notebook. Near the middle of the journal, the notes became more technical. References to medical journals. Letters exchanged with researchers. Then he found another envelope. This one had several printed pages inside. A formal document. Memorandum of Research Partnership. The letterhead belonged to the Rocky Mountain Biomedical Institute. Daniel read slowly. The institute had been studying Laura's plant samples for nearly 4 years. Their analysis suggested that one particular compound showed remarkable effectiveness in reducing nerve inflammation. Nerve inflammation. The exact condition Daniel's doctors had warned him about after the war. Daniel leaned back against the wall. His mind raced. Laura hadn't just been researching plants for curiosity. She had been looking for a treatment. For him. Atlas lifted his head suddenly. The dog walked toward the open doorway and sniffed the breeze again. Daniel watched him carefully. "Everything all right?" Atlas's ears twitched. Then he relaxed and sat down again. Daniel exhaled slowly. Greg had left, but the encounter had changed something. Daniel now understood that Laura's work might be worth far more than he had imagined. And that meant others might come looking for it. He closed the notebook gently and placed it back in the vault. The final formula vial rested beside the other samples. Daniel stared at it. Years of work, years of sacrifice, all hidden here in the middle of the Montana wilderness. He slowly closed the vault lid and replaced the floorboard. Atlas watched him carefully. "You did good finding that boy," Daniel said. The German shepherd's tail thumped softly against the wooden floor. Daniel walked outside. The afternoon sun had moved across the valley, casting long shadows from the surrounding mountains. The hut looked almost magical in the golden light. The vines covering the roof and walls glowed softly. White flowers hung in thick clusters, releasing their sweet fragrance into the air. Daniel walked around the structure slowly. Now that he understood what Laura had been doing, the plants looked different. Not wild, not random. Every vine had been trained carefully along the walls. Every flower seemed part of a deliberate pattern. The entire hut had become a living laboratory. Atlas trotted ahead and sniffed along the edge of the clearing. Then he stopped near the metal hatch he had uncovered earlier. The dog looked back at Daniel. Daniel walked over. He brushed away a bit more soil around the hatch. The hinges looked sturdy. He pulled it open. Inside lay rows of sealed sample containers, exactly as Laura had described in the letter. Early experiments, older generations of plants, preserved carefully. Daniel closed the hatch again. For the first time since Laura's death, he felt something stronger than grief. Responsibility. This place mattered. Not just because Laura had built it, but because the work inside it might help people. People like him. People who came home from war carrying invisible wounds. Atlas returned and sat beside him. Daniel scratched the dog behind the ears. "You think she knew we'd come here together?" he asked quietly. Atlas wagged his tail. The sun began lowering behind the mountains, turning the sky a deep orange. The clearing filled with long shadows. Daniel stood and looked at the hut again. "I guess we've got work to do," he said. Atlas barked once in agreement. For the first time since the funeral, Daniel Walker didn't feel completely lost. Laura had left him more than a memory. She had left him a mission, and he intended to protect it. The sun disappeared behind the Montana ridgeline, and the valley slowly sank into evening. Cold mountain air rolled down through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. Daniel lit a small lantern inside the hut. The soft yellow glow filled the wooden room and cast long shadows across the shelves of dried plants. Atlas settled near the doorway, but kept his eyes on the forest outside. The dog had the calm patience of a soldier on watch. Daniel returned to the wooden table and carefully opened the red research notebook again. Page after page of Laura's handwriting stretched before him. He studied the final entries more closely this time. The notes near the end were written only a few months before her death. Compound stabilization test. Successful. Improved anti-inflammatory response observed. Minimal side effects in preliminary testing. Daniel leaned closer to the page. Below the notes was a small line written more personally. Daniel's pain levels seem lower when exposed to diluted extract. Daniel sat back slowly. She had already tested the compound. On him. Small amounts. Probably mixed into the herbal teas she sometimes made in the evenings. The warm cups she always insisted would help him sleep better. He remembered those nights now. The dull fire in his back had eased slightly on those evenings. He had thought it was just comfort, just Laura being Laura. But she had been quietly testing the medicine she was creating. Atlas lifted his head and walked over. Daniel scratched behind the dog's ear. "She was smarter than both of us, wasn't she?" he said quietly. Atlas wagged his tail once. Daniel reached into the vault again and carefully lifted the vial marked Final Formula. The glass container looked almost fragile in the lantern light. Dark green liquid swirled slowly inside. Years of work. Years of quiet determination. Daniel studied the instructions Laura had left beside it. The dosage was extremely small, just a few drops diluted in water. He hesitated. Then he set the vial back on the table. Outside, the forest had grown darker. Wind brushed softly through the vines on the roof. Atlas suddenly stood up. His ears turned sharply toward the woods. Daniel noticed instantly. "What is it?" Atlas walked to the doorway again, his body tense. A low rumble escaped his chest. Daniel stepped beside him and looked into the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then a distant light flickered between the trees. A flashlight. Someone moving along the narrow road below the clearing. Daniel's stomach tightened. Greg. Or someone Greg had sent. The light moved slowly upward through the trees. Closer. Atlas's growl deepened. Daniel blew out the lantern. The hut plunged into darkness. Moonlight slipped through the vines, casting faint silver patterns across the wooden floor. Daniel crouched near the window. The flashlight beam appeared again between the trees. Whoever it was had left the road and was now climbing the hillside, straight toward the hut. Atlas stood silent and rigid beside him. Daniel whispered softly, "Stay quiet, boy." The light grew brighter as the person approached the clearing. Footsteps moved through the brush. Branches snapped under careful weight. The beams swept across the ground, then across the metal hatch, then toward the hut. Daniel's pulse hammered. Atlas's muscles tightened like coiled steel. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. For several seconds, the person simply stood there, watching. Then the flashlight switched off. Darkness swallowed the clearing again. Daniel strained his eyes, trying to see movement in the shadows. Atlas suddenly barked, loud, sharp, and then the dog bolted forward. Daniel rushed after him. Atlas exploded through the vines and sprinted toward the edge of the clearing. A figure ran. Daniel caught only a glimpse of a man's shape disappearing down the slope. Atlas chased him halfway down the hill before Daniel shouted, "Atlas, back!" The dog slowed and returned quickly. Daniel knelt and grabbed the dog's collar. "You all right?" he asked breathlessly. Atlas panted but wagged his tail. Whoever had come had already vanished into the forest. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring down the dark hillside. Someone had definitely been watching the hut, and now they knew Daniel was here. He walked slowly back toward the clearing. Atlas stayed glued to his side. Inside the hut, Daniel relit the lantern. The room looked the same as before, quiet, peaceful. But now the air carried tension. Daniel picked up the vial again. He studied it carefully. Greg wasn't the only one interested in Laura's work anymore. Word had already started to spread. Daniel placed the vial back into the vault and sealed it. Then he secured the floorboard again. Atlas returned to the doorway and lay down, but his eyes remained open, watching, guarding. Daniel leaned against the wooden wall and looked at the lantern flame. Laura had built something important here. Important enough to attract attention. Dangerous attention. Daniel rubbed his aching back slowly. Then he looked at Atlas. "Well, partner," he said quietly, "looks like this mission just got a lot more complicated." Atlas lifted his head and looked at Daniel, his dark eyes steady in the soft lantern light. The hut had grown colder during the night. Outside, the Montana forest whispered with quiet sounds. Wind brushing through pine branches, distant water moving somewhere far below the valley, and the occasional cry of a night bird. Daniel sat in the wooden chair beside the table. Sleep didn't come. Every small sound in the forest seemed louder now. Every shadow looked deeper. Atlas remained near the doorway, alert but calm. The German shepherd had settled into the role naturally. Guard, partner, soldier. Daniel finally stood and walked outside. The moon hung low above the mountain ridges, bathing the clearing in pale silver light. The vine-covered hut looked almost ghostly beneath it. Daniel walked slowly around the clearing, scanning the tree line. The hillside where Atlas had chased the stranger remained silent. No movement. But Daniel knew someone had been there, and that meant the secret Laura left behind was no longer safe. He returned inside and poured a small cup of water from the canteen in his bag. For a moment, his eyes drifted again to the vault beneath the floorboards. The vial. Laura's final formula. He wondered what she would say if she could see him now. Standing in the middle of her hidden laboratory, guarding the work she had built in silence. Atlas suddenly raised his head. His ears turned toward the road again. A distant engine growled somewhere down the valley. Daniel walked quickly to the doorway. Headlights appeared between the trees. A vehicle climbing the narrow dirt road. The engine sounded different this time. Slower. Heavier. The truck rolled into the clearing and stopped beside the hut. Daniel recognized it immediately. Greg's truck. The door opened. Greg stepped out, brushing dust from his jacket. But he wasn't alone. Another man stepped out of the passenger side. Tall, gray suit, city shoes that clearly didn't belong in the Montana wilderness. Atlas growled low. Daniel stepped forward into the moonlight. Greg smiled. "Evening again, Daniel." Daniel didn't answer. His eyes shifted to the second man. Greg gestured toward him. "This is Mr. Dalton," Greg said casually. "He's an investor." Mr. Dalton nodded politely. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Walker." Daniel crossed his arms. "What do you want?" Greg looked toward the hut. "You found something in there, didn't you?" Daniel remained silent. Greg sighed dramatically. "Come on, Daniel. We both know Laura was working on something." Mr. Dalton stepped forward calmly. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said. His voice was smooth, professional. Your late wife had been corresponding with several research institutions. My firm became aware of the work shortly before her passing. Daniel felt his chest tighten. So you followed me out here. Mr. Dalton smiled faintly. We prefer to call it due diligence. Atlas barked sharply. Greg rolled his eyes. Relax, mutt. Atlas took one step forward. Greg quickly stopped talking. Daniel spoke quietly. You should leave. Mr. Dalton raised a hand. Before we go, perhaps we could discuss a simple arrangement. Daniel didn't move. Mr. Dalton continued. If the research here is what we believe it to be, the commercial value could be extremely significant. He pulled a folded document from his jacket. A partnership agreement. Daniel said nothing. Mr. Dalton unfolded the paper. My firm would provide the funding necessary to complete clinical trials and bring the treatment to market. Greg added quickly. And in return, you get paid. Daniel stared at them. How much? Mr. Dalton answered calmly. $5 million to begin with. The number hung in the quiet clearing. Even Greg looked impressed by it. Daniel didn't react. Mr. Dalton continued speaking. And additional royalties once the treatment becomes available. Greg grinned. See? Everyone wins. Atlas's growl deepened. Daniel looked at the two men standing in front of him. $5 million. More money than he had ever imagined in his life. But Laura's letter echoed in his memory. This work wasn't meant to make someone rich. It was meant to help people living with pain like his. Daniel shook his head slowly. No. Greg blinked. What? I said no. Mr. Dalton studied him carefully. You may want to think about it. I already have, Greg's patience snapped. You're out of your mind, he snapped. Do you have any idea what you're turning down? Daniel's voice remained calm. This isn't yours to buy. Mr. Dalton sighed quietly. That's unfortunate. Greg stepped closer, anger flashing in his eyes. You think you can protect this place by yourself? Atlas stepped forward again. The dog's teeth gleamed in the moonlight. Greg stopped instantly. Mr. Dalton placed a hand on Greg's shoulder. Let's go, he said. Greg stared at Daniel for a long moment. You'll regret this. Then the two men climbed back into the truck. The engine roared. The headlights swung across the clearing. A moment later, the vehicle disappeared down the mountain road. Silence returned. Daniel stood in the clearing for a long time. Atlas sat beside him, watching the road. Finally, Daniel looked down at the dog. Well, he said quietly, looks like Laura's work just became the most valuable secret in Montana. Atlas wagged his tail once, and the night around the vine-covered hut grew very still. The truck's engine faded into the distance until the valley swallowed the sound completely. Daniel remained standing in the clearing for a long moment, watching the dark road that disappeared between the trees. The cold air settled around him. Atlas stepped closer and leaned his shoulder lightly against Daniel's leg. The dog seemed to understand something important had just happened. Daniel finally exhaled. Well, he said quietly, that didn't go the way they expected. Atlas huffed softly. Daniel turned and looked at the hut again. The vines rustled gently along the wooden walls. Moonlight spilled across the clearing, making the flowers glow faintly like pale stars. Laura had built something extraordinary here, and now the world had begun to notice. Daniel walked back inside the hut and closed the door behind him. Atlas settled beside it again, acting as silent guard. Daniel lit the lantern once more. The warm light returned to the wooden room, the shelves, the jars, the notebooks. Every inch of the place carried Laura's quiet determination. Daniel knelt and pulled up the loose floorboard again. The vault waited beneath. He opened it slowly. The metal lid creaked as it lifted. Inside, the containers and folders remained untouched. Daniel reached for the vial labeled Final Formula. He held it carefully under the lantern. The green liquid glowed softly in the glass. $5 million. The number Greg had shouted still echoed in Daniel's mind. But Laura had never cared about money. Daniel knew that better than anyone. He walked to the table and opened the red research notebook again. The final pages held something he hadn't fully read yet. Small printed charts were taped beside Laura's handwritten notes. Pain response chart. Volunteer test. Daniel's name appeared on the chart. Dates stretched across several months. Pain levels marked from 1 to 10. Daniel studied the notes slowly. Each week the number had dropped slightly. 8, 7, 6. By the final entry, the number had fallen to 4. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair. Laura had been helping him without ever telling him. She had been testing the medicine in the smallest doses, protecting him from disappointment if it didn't work. Atlas walked over and rested his chin on the table beside him. Daniel smiled faintly. "She knew, didn't she?" he said softly. Atlas wagged his tail. Daniel continued reading. The last page held a simple note written in Laura's careful handwriting. "If the final formula works, Daniel may finally have relief from the nerve pain the doctors warned us about." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. For years he had carried the dull fire in his back and legs, a constant reminder of the battlefield he had survived. Laura had been fighting that battle beside him, in secret. He looked again at the vial. Maybe she had succeeded. Daniel poured a small cup of water from the canteen. His hand hesitated over the vial. Atlas watched him closely. Daniel remembered the instructions Laura had written. 2 drops only. He carefully removed the cork and tilted the vial. 2 tiny drops slipped into the water. The liquid swirled briefly before disappearing. Daniel stared at the cup. Then he drank. The water tasted slightly bitter, herbal, earthy. He sat quietly and waited. Outside, the wind moved gently through the forest. Minutes passed. Atlas lay beside him, calm but watchful. Daniel leaned back in the chair. At first, nothing changed. Then, slowly, the familiar tightness in his lower back eased slightly. Daniel straightened. He rolled his shoulders carefully. The deep ache that usually settled into his spine after long days felt lighter. Not gone, but quieter. Daniel stood up slowly. He walked across the hut, then back again. The pain that normally flared when he moved too quickly didn't appear. Atlas stood and followed him, tail wagging. Daniel laughed softly. "Laura, you did it." He rubbed his back again. For the first time in years, the constant pressure had loosened. Daniel returned to the table and carefully sealed the vial again. The lantern flickered gently as the wind brushed the hut walls. Daniel looked around the room. Laura's work wasn't just valuable, it worked, which meant the danger around it was very real now. Greg wouldn't give up. Neither would men like Dalton. Daniel crouched and placed the vial back inside the vault. Then he sealed the lid. Atlas returned to the doorway and sat quietly. Daniel stood beside him. The forest stretched dark and endless beyond the clearing. Somewhere out there, people were already thinking about how to take what Laura had created. Daniel rested his hand on Atlas's head. "We protect this," he said. Atlas barked once. The lantern light glowed warmly inside the vine-covered hut, and for the first time since Laura's death, Daniel felt something stronger than grief. He felt hope. Morning arrived slowly in the Montana mountains. The first light of dawn slipped over the ridge and touched the clearing with a pale golden glow. The vines covering the hut shimmered softly with dew, each white flower catching the rising sunlight like tiny lanterns. Inside the hut, Daniel woke in the wooden chair beside the table. Atlas was already awake. The German shepherd stood at the doorway, watching the valley the way a seasoned soldier watches a perimeter. Daniel stretched carefully. Something felt different. For years, every morning had started the same way, with the dull stiffness in his back and legs reminding him that the war had never truly left his body. But today, the pain was still there, just quieter. Daniel stood slowly and took a few steps across the hut. His movements felt steadier than they had in a long time. Atlas turned and wagged his tail. "Morning, partner," Daniel said. The dog walked over and nudged his hand gently. Daniel stepped outside. The clearing looked peaceful in the morning light. The mountains stood silent and enormous around the valley, their peaks glowing orange as the sun climbed higher. The vine-covered hut looked almost alive in the daylight. Laura had chosen this place carefully, far from towns, far from noise, but still connected to the world through the narrow dirt road that wound down the valley. Daniel walked slowly around the clearing. Atlas trotted beside him. For a moment, Daniel simply breathed in the mountain air. Laura had spent years coming here, working quietly, building something that might help people she would never even meet. Daniel returned to the hut and opened the red notebook again. He found the page Laura had mentioned in her letter, a list of names, scientists, researchers, people who had believed in her work. One name stood at the top of the page: Dr. Helen Carter, Rocky Mountain Biomedical Institute. Next to the name was a phone number. Daniel stared at it for a long moment. Atlas sat beside him, watching quietly. "Looks like it's time," Daniel said. He stepped outside and pulled the satellite phone from his pack. The signal flickered briefly before stabilizing. Daniel dialed the number. The phone rang. Once, twice, then a woman's voice answered. "Dr. Carter speaking." Daniel took a breath. "My name is Daniel Walker," he said. There was a pause. Then the woman spoke again, her voice suddenly alert. "Daniel Walker. Laura Walker's husband?" "Yes." Another pause. Daniel heard papers shifting on the other end of the line. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks," Dr. Carter said. "After Laura passed, we didn't know how to contact you." Daniel looked at the hut. "She left instructions," he said. Dr. Carter's voice softened. "She was an extraordinary woman." Daniel nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know." Dr. Carter continued. "The work she started could help thousands of people suffering from nerve damage and chronic pain. But it needs protection and careful development." Daniel looked at Atlas. The German shepherd sat calmly beside him, ears forward. Daniel smiled slightly. "I'm not interested in selling it," he said. "I understand. But I do want to finish what she started." Another pause came across the line. Then Dr. Carter spoke again. "That's exactly what Laura hoped you would say." Daniel felt something warm settle in his chest. They talked for several minutes. Dr. Carter explained how the research could continue, how the Institute could help develop the medicine without turning it into something greedy investors could control. When the call ended, Daniel slipped the phone back into his pack. Atlas barked once. Daniel knelt and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Looks like we're not the only ones guarding this place anymore," he said. Atlas wagged his tail. The sun had fully risen now. The valley glowed with bright morning light. Daniel walked to the center of the clearing and looked back at the hut. The vines, the flowers, the quiet laboratory Laura had built with her own hands. Greg and men like Dalton would probably come back. People always chased money. But Laura's work was no longer hidden, and now it had allies. Daniel rested his hand on Atlas's head. "We did good, partner," he said softly. Atlas leaned gently against him. Daniel looked across the valley once more. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel empty. Laura had left him more than a hut in the mountains, more than research, more than a medicine. She had left him a reason to keep moving forward. And as the morning light spread across the Montana wilderness, Daniel Walker and his loyal dog stood together beside the vine-covered hut, protecting the legacy she had planted there. And as the morning light spread across the Montana wilderness, Daniel Walker and his loyal dog stood together beside the vine-covered hut, protecting the legacy she had planted there. Some legacies are not made of money or land. Some are made of love, sacrifice, and the quiet promises we keep for the people who believed in us. Laura planted something in that valley that would outlive her, and Daniel, with Atlas beside him, chose to protect it. But now, I want to ask you something. If you were in Daniel's place, would you have protected Laura's secret too? If your answer is yes, type 1 in the comments. If you believe loyalty like Atlas showed is the greatest kind of courage, type 0. Your comment might seem small, but it helps this story reach more people who still believe in loyalty, sacrifice, and second chances. And before you go, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next story we're about to share might be even more powerful. Another journey of a veteran, a loyal dog, and a secret that will change everything. Until then, take care of the people who stand beside you, just like Atlas stood beside Daniel.